Good morning from Taipei. This is Christianity and Liberty, and I am your host, Andy McCafferty. Today we're beginning a new series. We will be reading from Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell was one of the most important and his social historians of the 20th century, and he still is. Everything he writes is worth reading. We are going to begin with his book, Discrimination and Disparities. It's a very important book. I'm going to read from the book and then give a short explanation of what he means and why it is important. Afterwards, we will invite people to join the show for a discussion. If you would like to join a discussion, let me know. You can leave a comment on my YouTube channel. Okay, let's get started. Well, the book is called Discrimination and Disparities. After an introduction, he begins with a quote from Fernand Braudel. He was a very important French historian of the last century. In no society have all regions and all parts of the population developed equally. Well, we'll see as we read why that is the quote that he begins with. Okay, let's begin with the first short introduction. Sowell writes, large disparities in the economic and other outcomes of individuals, groups, and nations have produced reactions ranging from puzzlement to outrage. Attempts to explain the causes of these disparities have likewise produced a wide range of responses. At one end of the spectrum of explanations offered is the belief that those who have been less fortunate in their outcomes are genetically less capable. At the other end of the spectrum is the belief that those less fortunate are victims of other people who are more fortunate. In between, there are many other explanations offered. But whatever the particular explanation offered, there seems to be general agreement that the disparities found in the real world differ greatly from what might be expected by random chance. Yet the disparities in outcome found in economic and other endeavors need not be due to either comparable disparities in innate capabilities or comparable disparities in the way people are treated by other people. The disparities can also reflect the plain fact that success in many endeavors depends on prerequisites peculiar to each endeavor, and a relatively small difference in meeting these prerequisites can mean a very large difference in outcome. Well, Dr. Sowell in this book is going to discuss inequities in society. Historically, he's saying that progressives have given two sorts of explanations. Early in the 20th century, they often mentioned genetics. That was the reason for disparities. But as the 20th century went on until now, they've switched to the idea of discrimination. But both of these explanations are simplistic. They assume that we ought to get a society that's basically has no inequities. But Dr. Sowell is going to say the plain fact is that there have been thousands of societies in history, and none have seen the kind of equality or equity that progressives often expect. Why? It has to do with prerequisites for success and probability. And in the next section, Dr. Sowell begins to introduce this topic. Let's continue. Prerequisites and probabilities. The effect of prerequisites on probabilities is very straightforward. When there is some endeavor with 5 prerequisites for success, then by chance, by definition, the chances of success in that endeavor depend on the chances of having all 5 of these prerequisites simultaneously. These prerequisites need not be rare in order to produce skewed distributions of outcomes. For example, if these prerequisites are all so common that chances are 2 of 3 that any given person has any one of these 5 prerequisites, nevertheless, the odds are against having all 5 of the prerequisites for success in that endeavor. When the chances of having any one of the 5 prerequisites are 2 out of 3, as in this example, the chance of having all 5 simultaneously is 2/3 multiplied by itself 5 times. That comes out to be 32 out of 243, or about 1 in 8. In other words, the chances of failure are about 7 out of 8. All those people with fewer than 5 prerequisites have the same outcome, failure. Only those with all 5 of these prerequisites succeed. This creates a very skewed distribution of success, and nothing like a normal bell curve of distribution of outcomes that we might expect otherwise. Okay, this needs to be explained. Dr. Sowell is discussing simple probability theory. He mentions an example where there are 5 prerequisites. He also mentions that sometimes people think that naturally the outcomes, economic outcomes, will be like a bell curve. In a bell curve distribution, there is a middle, and most people are near the middle. The further you get from the middle, the less people there are. A simple summary of the bell curve is often given as the 68, 95, 99 rule. What this means is that in a bell curve, it's the kind you'll see in a class where A, B, C, D, E, where most people are in the C range, less are in the B, D range, and very few are in the A, E range. But what that bell curve 68, 95, 99 rule is that 68% of the people are within one step of the middle, 34 above the middle, 34% below the middle. 95% of the people are within 2 steps of the middle, half of those above, half of those below. And 99% are within 3 steps of the middle. This is an important idea. In terms of economics, the middle might be the middle of the middle class. The people 1 step away are all the people in the middle class, some in the upper middle class, some in the lower middle class. 2 steps away would be from the upper class to the lower class. 3 steps away would be from the rich to the poor. So in a bell curve distribution, we would expect 68% of the people to be in the middle class, 95% to be from either in the upper, middle, or lower class, and then only 5% being very rich or very poor. People don't expect that in a fair society, everyone will be equal, but many people think that in a fair society, it would at least be like a bell curve, most people in the middle. Dr. Sowell is saying there is no reason to expect even a bell curve. People who have all the right prerequisites are going to have a high-paying job and get into the upper class. People missing 1 or 2 prerequisites, which probably be the majority, are going to be in a lower class, or perhaps the lower middle class. Or consider another example, very important example. Suppose there are 240 countries in the world. Suppose that in order to be a well-to-do country, the following 5 are all prerequisites: a good governmental system, a good educational system, most people educated and their quality colleges and graduate schools, natural resources, water, minerals. We might also include a seashore. The country isn't a desert unless it has a lot of oil. The 4th is a culture that encourages hard work. The 5th, a meritocracy. In other words, talented people are able to advance in the society. Suppose that 2/3 of all countries have each of these things. That is, For any country, the probability of having any one of these is 2/3. The result will be that 1 out of 8 countries will have all 5 and become well-to-do countries. 7 out of 8 countries will not be well-to-do, which is something like we find in the real world. So there's 2 points. It's not a bell curve with most of the countries in the middle. And the other point he's making in the whole book, the difference is not due to genetic superiority or discrimination. It's due to such things as lacking natural resources or a culture that encourages hard work. Okay, let's go on. We continue. What does this little exercise in arithmetic mean in the real world? One conclusion is that we should not expect success to be evenly or randomly distributed among individuals, groups, institutions, or nations in endeavors with multiple prerequisites, which is to say, most meaningful endeavors. And if these are indeed prerequisites, then having 4 out of 5 prerequisites means nothing as far as successful outcomes are concerned. In other words, people with most of the prerequisites for success may nevertheless be utter failures. Whether a prerequisite that is missing is complex or simple, its absence can negate the effect of all the other prerequisites that are present. If you are illiterate, for example, all the other good qualities that you may have in abundance count for nothing in many, if not most, careers today. As late as the 1950s, more than 40% of the world's adult population were still illiterate. That includes more than half of the adults in Africa and Asia. If you are not prepared to undergo the extended toil and sacrifice that some particular endeavor may require, then despite having all the native potential for great success in that endeavor, and with all the doors of opportunity wide open, you can nevertheless become an utter failure. Okay, the point about illiteracy is that if you are illiterate, you might be very smart with a very high IQ and very hardworking, but you will probably not have a high-paying job. It's part of the explanation why African countries, as well as some Asian countries, haven't seen the progress that they might otherwise see. The point about extended toil and sacrifice is that some jobs require this. For these jobs, you might be highly qualified in every way, except that you would want a family life, and so you are not willing to work 80 hours a week for 20 years. If so, you will not get the job. Dr. Sowell doesn't say this, but others argue that more men than women are willing to do this sort of thing. And that is one reason that jobs like the CEOs of major companies are mostly men. We continue. Not all the prerequisites are necessarily within the sole control of the individual who has them or does not have them. Even extraordinary capacities in one or some of the prerequisites can mean nothing in the ultimate outcome. Back in the early 20th century, for example, Professor Louis M. Terman of Stanford University launched a research project that followed 1,470 people with IQs of 140 and above for more than half a century. Data on the careers of men in this group, from an era when full-time careers for women were less common, showed serious disparities even within this rare group, all of whom had IDs within the top 1%. Some of these men had highly successful careers, others had more modest achievements, and about 20% were clearly disappointments. Of 150 men in this least successful category, only 8 received a graduate degree, and dozens of them received only a high school diploma. A similar number of the most successful men in Terman's group received 98 graduate degrees, more than a tenfold disparity among men who were all in the top 1% in IQ. Meanwhile, two men who were tested in childhood and who failed to make the 140 IQ cutoff level later earned Nobel Prizes in physics. While none of these men with IQs of 140 and above received a Nobel Prize in any field. Clearly then, all the men in Terman's group had at least one prerequisite for that extraordinary achievement, a Nobel Prize, namely, they had a high enough IQ. And equally clearly, there must have been other prerequisites that none of the hundreds of these men with IQs in the top 1% had. As for factors behind differences in educational and career outcomes within Terman's group, the biggest differentiating factor was in family backgrounds. Men with the most outstanding achievements came from middle-class and upper-class families and were raised in homes where there were many books. Half of their fathers were college graduates at a time when that was far more rare than today. Among those men who were least successful, nearly one-third had a parent who had dropped out of school before the 8th grade. Even extraordinary IQs did not eliminate the need for other prerequisites. Sometimes what is missing may be simply someone to point an individual with great potential in the right direction. An internationally renowned scholar once mentioned at a social gathering that when he was a young man, he had not thought about going to college until someone else urged him to do so. Nor was he the only person of exceptional ability of whom that was true. Some other people, including people without his great abilities, would automatically apply to college if they came from particular social groups where that was a norm. But without that one person who urged him to seek higher education, this particularly internationally renowned scholar might well have become a good worker in some line of work requiring no college degree, but not a world-class scholar. Okay, what Professor Terman's research shows is that men with high IQs may have below average outcome. And in Dr. Sowell's language, this is because they're missing some other prerequisite for success. Now, Dr. Sowell notes that the main differentiating factor in Dr. Terman's research were family background, homes that had a lot of books. This will be a recurring theme in the book, the importance of family background. We can understand this, but Dr. Sowell is not relying on common sense. He will be giving us statistics to show that this is the case, whether we like it or not. Let's go on. There may be more or less of an approximation of a normal bell curve as far as how many people have any particular prerequisite, and yet a very skewed distribution of success based on having all the prerequisites simultaneously. This is not only true in theory, empirical evidence suggests that it is true also in practice. In golf, for example, there is something of an approximation of a bell curve when it comes to the distribution of such examples of individual skills as the number of putts per round of golf or driving distances off the tee, and yet there is a grossly skewed distribution of outcome requiring a whole range of golf skills, namely winning Professional Golfers Association PGA tournaments. Most professional golfers have never won a single PGA tournament in their entire lives, while just 3 golfers, Arnold Palmer, Jack Nicklaus, and Tiger Woods, won more than 200 PGA tournaments between them. Moreover, there are similarly skewed distributions of peak achievements in baseball and tennis, among other endeavors. Dr. Sowell is pointing out that this is the way life is. In really difficult endeavors with many prerequisites, there can be a bell curve on each of the prerequisites, but most people fail because they don't have all the prerequisites, while a few people spectacularly succeed. Why do we expect a bell curve in terms of things like salaries, is his question, or high-paying jobs? There is no good reason and little reason to think discrimination is the reason. Let me continue. Given multiple prerequisites for many human endeavors, we should not be surprised if economic or social advances are not evenly or randomly distributed among individuals, groups, institutions, or nations at any given time. Nor can we be surprised if the laggards of one century forge ahead in some later century, or if the world leaders in one era become laggards in another era. When the gain or success of just one prerequisite can turn failure into success or turn success into failure, it should not be surprising in a changing world if the leaders and laggards of one century or millennium exchange places in some later century or millennium. If the prerequisites themselves change over time with the development of new kinds of endeavors, or if advances in human knowledge revolutionize existing endeavors, the chance of a particular pattern of success and failure becoming permanent may be greatly reduced. Dr. Sowell will give us some examples of this that have happened in history, where countries in one century who were leaders became laggards in a later century. We continue. Perhaps the most revolutionary change in the evolution of human societies was the development of agriculture. Within the last 10% of the existence of the human species, agriculture made possible the feeding of concentrated populations in cities, which in turn have been and remain the source of most of the landmark scientific, technological, and other advances of the human race that we call civilization. The earliest known civilizations arose in geographic settings with strikingly similar characteristics. These included river valley subject to annual floodings, whether in ancient Mesopotamia, in the valley of the Indus River on the Indian subcontinent in ancient times, along with the Nile in ancient Egypt, or in the Yellow River Valley in ancient China. Clearly, there were other prerequisites, since these particular combinations of things had not produced agriculture or civilizations dependent on agriculture for most of the existence of the human species. Genetic characteristics peculiar to the races in these particular locations hardly seem likely to be the key factor, since the population of these areas are by no means in the forefront of human achievement today. Well, he's starting to give you the example. People might think, well, why did the Egyptians and the Chinese and people along the Indus River and the other examples that he gave succeed to produce the first cities? And some people might say, oh, because they were smarter than other people. But Dr. Sowell is pointing out, no, it's probably because they all had a river valley that flooded. And that was the thing that marked all of these things in common. We come on to the last section. We're almost done. Patterns of very skewed distributions of success have long been common in the real world, and such skewed outcomes contradict some fundamental assumptions on both the political left and the political right. People on opposite sides of many issues may both assume a background level of probabilities that is not realistic. Yet that flawed perception of probabilities and the failure of the real world to match expectations derived from that flawed perception can drive ideological movements, political crusades, and judicial decisions, up to and including decisions of the Supreme Court of the United States, where disparate impact statistics showing different outcome for different groups have been enough to create a presumption of discrimination. In the past, similar statistical disparities were enough to promote genetic determinism, from which came eugenics, laws forbidding interracial marriages, and where there were other prerequisites for monumental catastrophe, the Holocaust. In short, gross disparities among peoples in their economic outcomes, scientific discoveries, technical advances, and other achievements have inspired efforts at explanation that span the ideological spectrum. To subject these explanations to the tests of facts, it may be useful to begin by examining some empirical evidence about disparities among individuals, social groups, institutions, and nations. Well, Dr. Sowell speaks in a very low-key voice, but he is addressing the most important issues in the 20th century and in our society today. We plainly see that some groups do better economically than others, and progressives today shout and scream that is all because of discrimination. They used to shout eugenics, but now they shout racism. But they fail to consider that the difference might be that some groups have all the prerequisites for success and other groups are missing one or two. This and probability theory is enough to explain the inequities. It's easy to misunderstand Dr. Sowell, so I close with some comments. Dr. Sowell is an African American, and one of his main concerns is to help African Americans. But we must have a clear idea of where the problem is in order to give a helpful solution. Now, it might help, this is my own distinction, it might help to distinguish between the past, the present, and the future of U.S. race relations. The past. This is the historical sources of the present situation in the U.S. Here, that awful institution of slavery, segregation, and the 1960s civil rights movement, of course, a good movement, are clearly important. Dr. Sowell affirms this, while at the same time saying that we must also include other factors, such as the migration of Southern blacks to the North and the war on poverty. We have to look historically from the facts. What was the cause of the current situation, not to oversimplify it. The present, that's the most important. What are the causes of the wage gap in the present, or the economic gap in the present? Dr. Sowell, from my reading, would include discrimination as a minor factor, but major factors are poor inner-city family culture and the lack of early childhood education in the home. Things like single-parent families, things like the children or kids, once they get in junior high school, senior high school, discouraging each other from studying. That, he thinks, is much more important, the present, to give the explanation of why there's still a wage gap today. And thirdly, the future. If Dr. Sowell is correct, we should focus on changing inner city family culture and their attitudes, and the attitude towards education, as well as especially early childhood education. Rather than shouting and screaming about discrimination, it might make people feel good, but it's not going to solve any of the problems. Well, that's it. We hope you enjoyed this show. We will continue reading and discussing Dr. Sowell's Discrimination and Disparities next week. Thanks for listening. If you want to leave me a comment, you can do so on my new YouTube channel. I'm Andy McCafferty, the host of Christianity and Liberty. Goodbye.